So welcome to Keen on Yoga to Christian Lee Novetzke and Sunila Kale. It's the Yoga of Power we're talking about, their new book, Yoga as Political Thought and Practice in India. So kind of Tales of Power or Yoga as Power. Welcome, guys. Lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. We're really happy to be here.
So I think everyone's seen that thing on Facebook that kind of went quite viral, I think. That was the video you posted we talked about before of the Raja of Aundh. Who's got a long name I don't want to try and pronounce right now. Yeah. And he was maybe later. And he was showcasing his Surya Namaskar practice in his own state, Aundh. And it really went viral. And I have heard a little bit about that before. Many people asked me to then interview on the back of that. And the book is interesting. I have to confess it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse because it's yoga as power. So I understand that you kind of thought about doing something slightly different, and then it kind of got into that territory. Is that right? How did you kind of come upon that unique idea? And because yoga can be so many things, but unusually to hear yoga used as power these days.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. And we'll get a chance to talk about how we came upon the film and why we focused so much attention in that chapter on Aundh. But to respond to your first question, how we came to this, we thought we were going to write a book when we first started talking about this. I'm trained as a political scientist, so I think about politics. He's trained as a historian of religion. So thinking about the intersection of yoga and politics seemed to be the way that we would approach this project. And at the time that we were thinking about it in 2014-15, the two spheres, yoga as psychophysical practice, the kind of yoga that you are an expert in, and the world of politics, legal politics, cultural politics, international affairs, was kind of colliding with yoga's, Modi's International Yoga Day, but also all these legal cases around whether yoga should be taught in public schools, and also whether yoga was a kind of cultural appropriation. So we thought that would be our approach to thinking about the intersections of these two. But over the course of the last decade, a couple of things happened. One, there was a lot of additional great scholarship that kind of approached these questions. A lot of it focused on what was happening in the United States. So I'm thinking of work like Andrea James, but also Father Woodridge, people who are thinking about the practice of psychophysical yoga and how it was being commodified, or how it was being used in prisons, as Godrej does. And as we started thinking more about our own work, we started to think that yoga itself might have something to say about politics, that yoga itself might express some ideas about power and politics. And that became far more interesting to us. And it became a place where we thought we could make kind of a novel contribution. And, one of the reasons that we started down this path also was those classic texts of Hatha Yoga, like the Hatha Pradipika, which have these curious passages at the beginning that tell a yogi to pay attention to his or her social and political world. So we thought, so why would these texts that are about psychophysical practice have anything to say about the political and social context in which one does yoga? What does that mean? And that sort of set us down this path of really looking at texts that maybe people haven't already or haven't traditionally looked at in the study of yoga, texts like the Rigveda, texts like the Arthashastra, to try to uncover some of this.
Yeah, I think we kind of also did something that academics are kind of trained to do. We got interested in a subject, and then we kind of dug into the subject to see where there were spaces still for more to be said. And yoga studies is this enormous, when we talk about how much we admire the field, it is an enormous, eclectic field of study that uniquely has connections with all sorts of forms of practice, forms of medicine. So it's very unique within South Asia studies, for example. So in that context, we entered into the question of yoga, maybe in some ways the way you've entered into that question when you read the book, which is yoga as psychophysical practice. And we saw that in yoga studies, that is the presumption that most people take. This is about psychophysical practice or about philosophy. So the book started down that road, right? We were wondering about what is the relationship between the psychophysical practice of yoga and politics. But as Sunila said, it kind of evolved when we saw that there's a deeper history to this term that we didn't really see discussed or peripherally discussed, but then kind of left aside once the stream of psychophysical yoga or of philosophy is taken up. So that's how the book changed. It changed because we had no predisposition to study psychophysical yoga. We just wanted to know what this word meant and its power over time, which I think is different than the way some people enter into the field, and which is not a critique of the field at all. That's built this enormous, magnificent field, but it wasn't something we felt we needed to do.
Mm. Right.
So to just jump in and add to what Christian said. So in the book, we start out in the introduction saying, okay, we recognize the field of yoga studies articulates the subject of their study as either philosophy or psychophysical practice. And our contribution in the book is to suggest that there is a third sphere of yoga, which is as an expression of politics and power, that intersects with and yet is also distinct from those other two spheres. And our book is an attempt to kind of make that argument, to try to convince our readers of what we have kind of become convinced by.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as perhaps a slight denial on the field of yoga because it doesn't want to maybe admit other roots or other aspects of the terminology, right? That will seem to kind of, pollute its spirituality. But of course, I mean, if we look at the start of the 20th century, we see figures like Yogendra or Krishnamacharya or any of the early modern teachers. They were doing a good PR job to try and make yoga, respectful, presentable again to middle class Indian public, right? Because it was associated very much with mind control, sorcery, fakirs that would come and steal your kids in the night. So I think it's only recently, really, that we've found this idea of yoga as a way to gain power, personal power or social power, kind of pushed really to the margins, which makes your book so surprising, actually, and so much needed. Because, I think it goes to show that it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It's just, another face of yoga, really. And certainly, when you look at the Rigveda or the Vedas, you don't really, as much as one tries to dig, unless you go, rather metaphorical, you can't really find obvious ways where it's like, oh, this is definitely the yoga that we're that we're doing now. I mean, everything points to yoga as hitching up the chariots for war, really. So, I mean, I suppose going back to the first chapter of your book, going back to the start, would you like to talk a little bit about yoga in the Vedas, the term? Yeah.
Sure, I can start. So, in the book, we point out there's this enormous text, the Rigveda, which is the oldest text that we have existent, that you can kind of situate within India or within Indian culture, or that has had an influence on Indian culture. This text itself is what we have, that's from 1400 BC, is itself the result of many thousands of years of accumulation. So to say how old the text is very hard. And it's a huge text. So we do something in that is at odds with the great size of the thing we're talking about. We look at the appearance of a very particular word, which only really appears 21 or 22 times, right? So if you think of that vast corpus, this is an infinitesimal, tiny little piece of it we're looking at. But it's a consistent piece. And it's a piece that in the time after the Rigveda, that word, which brings us to your podcast, has a lot of power. It's had power consistently over those millennia. So we decided to just see, what does this word mean in this text? And we only looked at the word. So, the word has a verbal root, which means it has many other kinds of forms. We only looked at the word yoga or yogam. We only looked at that word. When we looked at that word, we found these three kind of uses. We call them literal, metonymic, and metaphorical. And the literal use is hitching a war chariot to a horse. The word hitching here is yoke or yoga, right? Which is why the words are cognate. They sound the same. After that very literal meaning, just hitching that horse up, we talk about the metonymic meaning. So just like, the pen represents literature, the hitching of the horse represents war. And we rely on a fantastic new translation of this work by Jameson and Brereton, where we show how they are translating this word as war, and how they argue that in many cases, in those metonymic cases, the word just means war, because that's the only reason you hitch your chariot up to your horse. And we point out that no other animals get hitched up this way. The verbal root might be used for other animals, like cows, for example, but the word yoga is not used. So we go from that literal meaning and the metonymic meaning to a metaphorical one, which is power, control over something, or rather the control that you exert over something that's powerful in order to harness that power, horsepower, for example. So we talk about that, and we talk about the things that get metaphorically hitched other than a horse. And these are things like the Vedas, so the verses, the actual verses of the text, thoughts, the way you think about things, and this word like Ruta, it's a word that is so old. It's like yoga. It's so old that it comes out in English in multiple ways, like right as in a rite of passage, right as in correct, art as in creating art, truth. All these words have a cognate to this word that also gets harnessed. So that helps us develop this very, very elemental meaning. But what we also do is we point out that when some other scholars have asked this question, what does yoga mean, or where is yoga in the Rigveda? They're asking that question from the point of view of where is psychophysical yoga, or where is yoga philosophy? So where are the guys who check out of society, who have dreadlocks and long hair and sit at the periphery of everything and are kind of scary? So a lot of work on yoga in the Rigveda has gone to a section of the Rigveda that talks about the Keshans, or the long-haired men who sit outside of society, and perhaps they are earlier proto-yogis. What we point out is the word yoga never appears in relationship to them. The word yogi doesn't appear anywhere, so there is no person who's named a yogi. So one can take that perspective, right, that I'm looking for psychophysical yoga, and go back into this text to try to see the rudiments of it, and that's a perfectly fine thing to do. We just, because we weren't invested in trying to find psychophysical yoga, we just asked the question, what does the word mean? And there are many great scholars who have taken similar approaches, and really so much of this work relies on the fantastic scholarship of other people. And through that, we kind of develop this argument that the commonality that we see in the Rigveda of this word yoga is harnessing a powerful thing, a means to harness a powerful thing, a technique that you use, a strategy that you use. And that becomes the basis for the rest of our discussion.
I'll just jump in just to say that, when we thought, okay, let's see if this word yoga really does have this political valence, or has something to say about power, we need to find a textual genealogy for this idea. And our approach to try to uncover that was like threefold. One, we'll look at India's oldest text, which is the Rigveda, the oldest extant text. We'll look at India's longest text, which is the Mahabharata, and within it, the Bhagavad Gita, where yoga as a political idea and karma yoga was already kind of known to us because of the nationalist period of the 20th century. And then the text that is most clearly about politics and political economy, which is the Arthashastra. And if yoga has a meaning related to power and politics in all three of those, we thought, okay, that for us is a demonstration that there's a fruitful avenue to pursue.
Yeah, there's enough kind of meat on the bone to explore that further. I mean, certainly the Arthashastra seems to be the one. I mean, I suppose maybe talk a little bit about that, and how you trace it between the Rigveda and then tenuous ideas really about the meaning of yoga. I mean, it really just hitching that chariot, right? And I mean, obviously there's one notable scholar that suggests that it's about rigging the body, of David Gordon White famously suggests that it is a metaphor, but everyone else just does seem to kind of almost exclude the meaning of yoga there and come back to it in, well, a Katha Upanishad or something like that, right? So how do you trace it from the Rigveda to the Arthashastra and see it developing as a term? And yeah, just flesh that out for us, if you would.
I'm not sure that we actually do a very convincing job of tracing its evolution between these texts and between the moments in which these texts are kind of codified. Rather our selection of these texts for us was a demonstration that the idea has some merit, and really then an invitation for scholars, if they like us, see sort of some possibility in this, to think about what connects the time periods between, right? But maybe we can tell you a little bit about the Arthashastra and how we approach yoga and its cognate term Yogakshema in that text.
Yeah, and I would add a couple of things. So David is absolutely right, and actually, I believe in the Kathopanishad that very metaphor exists. The one where there is this prevalent metaphor that you're reining in your senses with yoga, and the senses are the horses, and you're controlling the horses. So you're controlling, arguably one of the most powerful things that you need to control in different psychophysical forms of yoga is your nervous system, are your senses. And so David's absolutely right. But, David's interest is in the origins of psychophysical and philosophical yoga. And so those are not necessarily our interests. So while he's absolutely right, the metaphor gets used, what we argue is the literal meaning is also maintained. So if you kind of follow the track and you imagine it bifurcating so that this word starts to name a whole set of ways to control something very powerful, like your nervous system, right? Or other things, right? We're arguing there's that earlier stream continues. It continues along its way. And one linking set of texts we look at, or text, is the Mahabharata. So the Mahabharata we talk about as a linking text. And we're not this isn't original to us. And many scholars have said that the concept of yoga that appears in the Mahabharata has sort of Vedic origins. Because in the Vedic context, it's about war. And in the Mahabharata, it's about war. And the famous Bhagavad Gita is a text about war. Whatever else it is about, and it's about many things, there's much in it, but the frame is a war, and it is the thing that starts the war. So we kind of start with that point. If you have a fundamental text that talks about yoga, like the Bhagavad Gita, and it is a text about a war, then what we have set up as a fundamental meaning of yoga must be present. Right? It can't not be present. It's explicitly there. It's actually in some ways the most explicit subject of yoga is war in that sense, because it's about getting war started.
The irony.
So we look at that and we connect, but we don't really talk that much about the Gita because many people have. We talk more about the Shanti Parvan, so the 12th book of the Mahabharata, where Bhishma is on a bed of arrows, and that's what's on the cover of our book, an image of Bhishma on his bed of arrows, and he, like Krishna, is a yogi, and he is teaching yoga. And what we talk about is that the first kind of yoga he's teaching one of the Pandavas, the Yudhishthira, who will now go on to rule, how to be a good king. And those lessons are about yoga. So how do you yoke the problems of your kingdom? How do you yoke the functioning of your state? And it isn't until after he's given all those lessons that he talks about moksha dharma, which he talks about how to use yoga to defeat death and rebirth and reach liberation, reach moksha. So that's that linking piece that connects us that we try to use. As Sunila said, I mean, we're not tracing a sort of watertight genealogy, but for us, we're tracing what seem like very obvious things that connect the yoga of the Rigveda through the Mahabharata to the yoga of the Arthashastra.
I suppose the question that comes to mind is, can you clearly divide yoga as a political science, and yoga as a means of developing one's own power within the capacity of then manipulating a populace? I mean, can you see two different streams, or are they always? I imagine your work is very kind of like trying to maybe pick the two apart, or are you happy to keep them together, or do they always come together?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that we're suggesting is that the word yoga itself refuses a complete separation of the spheres of, what we think of as sort of religion, right? Having to do with liberation, having to do with your understanding of yourself in the universe, and the political world. That those two, yoga refuses to separate them, and which is why it's an interesting term for us. And Christian's right that we mostly focus on the larger Mahabharata epic. But one of the things that we point out about the Bhagavad Gita is that it's a text in which the three ideas of yoga are all present. So yoga as philosophy, yoga as psychophysical practice, and yoga as war. And that's most clearly evident in the way that Krishna is described as a Yogeshwar, a lord of yoga. And he's described as a Yogeshwar 3 times. And the first time it's in reference to, or one of the times it's in reference to his understanding of yoga philosophy and its liberatory potential. One in reference to yoga as the harnessing of the senses in preparation for battle. And the third time is Krishna as a master of war strategies. So all three ideas of yoga are resonant in that text.
It's in the Gita.
Yes.
So
right. I haven't caught that. Which chapter?
Very last line, the very last line of the Gita, where Krishna is called a Yogeshwar, and Krishna, and this is when Arjun finally picks up his bow. That's what she's referring to. And he's called a Yogeshwar, and we're following Mahendale, who makes that argument. Yeah. But I would add to something that Sunila is saying is that and to go to your point, can you really separate it? So we point out in the Mahabharata, this is not separated. It is all mixed together, and there is no separation. But in the Rigveda, it's very clearly there. The word yoga never has any meaning related to psychophysical practice or philosophy in that sense. But the Arthashastra is a place that does clearly and definitively separate this yoga from all other kinds of yoga. And again, this is a term question. So what we do in the Arthashastra is we say, what does the word yoga mean? And nowhere in that text does yoga mean philosophy. Nowhere does it mean psychophysical practice. But it is all over that text. Right? So the word yoga is all over it. What does it mean if it doesn't mean those two things?
I will say that when we discovered that was the kind of moment. It was kind of like an aha moment. It was like, oh, okay,
now
there's really something. You look at this text that is only about politics and the science of governance, and we find yoga all over the text. Then clearly, in the millennia, over the millennia in which this word is deployed in various contexts, it has this meaning very clearly.
Yeah, and I would say in gratitude to David and his work, part of what led us to that text was in Sinister Yogis when he's talking about yogis in the Arthashastra. We were like, oh, we've got to read the Arthashastra now. We've got to figure out what he means. So that's what led us kind of there. But what we found is something a little different than what David found, in that David is identifying the various kinds of ascetics that populate that text. He's referring to them as yogis, and there's no reason not to. I don't think technically there's any reason that he would be wrong. These various figures are often called yogis elsewhere. They're just never called yogis in the text, right? So in the text, there are no yogis. The word yogi doesn't appear. Yogin, yogini doesn't appear. But you have lots of ascetics, and all the things he says about ascetics posing as existing as spies, or spies posing as ascetics, or being double agents, and all of these things, it's all there, as he says. Because we're not looking for the ascetics, we're not looking for the yogis, we're not looking for psychophysical practice, we have a different approach. We don't need to look for that there, so we just see what is there. And our argument is there is no, these other two kinds of yoga are not there. Psychophysical and philosophical. Only this third kind, yoga as power, yoga as political statecraft, is present.
It strikes me the text is a little bit like Machiavelli's The Prince, like a kind of an intrigue and a way to play people off against each other. But then, as well, you have this idea going throughout the book that there is this use of yoga as not just gaining power for yourself and however you want to use it, but for the sake of social harmony, right? So, which does then dovetail a little bit more into, something which we might suggest is for the at least for the well-being of everyone, even the physical well-being. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, maybe?
Yeah. You want to talk about the compound word yoga?
Okay, sure. So yoga, the word yoga in political statecraft is often also associated with this word kshema. And this is in the Rigveda. This is all throughout the Mahabharata. It's actually also in the Bhagavad Gita.
It's also the tagline of the current Life Insurance Corporation of India.
Yeah, so it exists all the way into the present. But it exists throughout the Arthashastra is arguably a text about how to achieve this. So what is it? The Arthashastra goes into great detail to define yoga as the mobilization of one's power, right? The activation of one's power. That often means war, but it can also mean bluffing. It can mean negotiating treaties. It can mean all kinds of things. And kshema means the state that you've achieved when your enemies are pacified or held at bay or made allies. So it's the time of pacification. It's the time when domestic unrest or border unrest is quelled. So the two are together. When they're together, they mean something like being able to keep the peace and the prosperity of your kingdom through force. So those as they travel together, in the Rigveda, it often meant two seasons of activity. One is where you hitch up and you conquer and take land, and the other is where you settle. Because the Aryans, the people are called Aryans, so Arya, the people who are from the Indo-European world, and they call themselves as Arya, and they come in possibly to the subcontinent.
Yeah.
They are mobile. Yeah. They are mobile and they have horses, and so this is very important to them.
If I was to ask you a percentile, for example, between yoga as warfare and yoga as social harmony, I mean, as you suggest in Sinister Yogis, David definitely has a take on this idea of yoga being a kind of, a lot of it's about, some kind of sorcery, right? Gaining superpowers for oneself, manipulating other people. And then you have yoga as, the social harmony, as you mentioned, the Raja of Aundh. How do you balance it up when you've traced the word between the two, yoga? Yeah.
Well, I think the point of finding the word in this compound form, Yogakshema, implies that one in this philosophy of power and politics, the two are inseparable. That is, without the capacity to exert force and control, you can't achieve the peace, the stability, the harmony that's necessary for a well-governed land, right? So the reason, the reason that it's not all just devilry and mayhem is that the aim for the king is to create the conditions for people to prosper, for all kinds of things to prosper, including psychophysical yoga practice, so that those ascetics should also flourish in this context of Yogakshema.
Yeah, I would say for people who practice psychophysical yoga, you might be interested to know other terms are here associated with Yogakshema in the Arthashastra that are also associated with yoga outside in psychophysical texts, like Hatha Yoga texts. So one of these terms is mandala. So a mandala, right, is something that you'll hear talked about in yoga studios and in yoga practice. It exists as a very important theoretical idea within the Arthashastra. And what it means is circle. And it means you negotiate a circle the way you are encircled by others. Those others could be enemies. Those others could be friends. And Yogakshema is part of the strategy of negotiating those relationships. Will you make an ally? Will you make an enemy? An enemy you have to use yoga on. An ally helps you create a condition of kshema, right? So the mandala concept is very central to this idea of yoga too. That you, as a king, are surrounded by political conflict or political allies, but a political potential. And you affect that surrounding. You control your mandala, you control that circle, and you expand it with the idea that you expand forever so that you are the lord of a universe where you have expanded your mandala. And so those really can't be divided. There are many ways to talk about what this would mean in practice. But one thing we point out in the book is that yoga studios often start, a yoga teacher, maybe you start by saying, set an intention. Right? Have an intention for your practice.
I don't usually say that.
You don't usually say that.
No.
Yeah, but I've heard it many times.
No. I know it's said. Yeah, I know
an intention.
Yeah.
So what we're suggesting is that the intention is conveyed through the idea that yoga gets you somewhere, right? So the intention. So we talk about this in the book as a transitive property of yoga. That just like a sentence has a transitive property, a subject, a verb, an object. What we suggest is that yoga is that verb that connects you as the subject to the thing you want to control, the object. And so it's transitive. You're moving that power over to that object you want to control. So that's why we think there's a set your intention kind of thing. And in the Arthashastra, the intention that's being told to the king, this is the intention you should set. You should defeat your enemies in your immediate circle. You should make friends if you can. and those are your allies for defeating others, and you sit at the apex of that system.
So then it gets kind of very vague, really. It's just yoga for skillful means, really, like any method that can be utilized to gain your intentions, really. That's as wide as that.
We offer a really simple definition of yoga that's kind of based on it's inferred from how we read its operation in all these different texts and contexts that we look at, which is that yoga is a means of controlling something. That's the definition that we offer of yoga, which doesn't sit in contradistinction to like how yoga is used in psychophysical practice, right? It's probably similar to how you understand it in your yoga studio. I think it's not dissimilar to how people understand it as a term of philosophy as well.
Yeah, so to relate that to something that is more modern focused. So, I'm sure you know Mark Singleton's extraordinary book, Yoga Body. And what resulted from that book, some people being quite upset about his argument, there's not a clear continuity, there are discontinuities. So one of the things we're interested in is in the 19th century, you have a debate about whether the Surya Namaskar is yoga or not. But the debate is really about whether the Surya Namaskar is Hatha yoga or not, right? Which is a very different question than whether it's yoga.
Yeah, very true.
And what we argue is that in the Raja of Aundh, for example, clearly the Surya Namaskar is yoga for him. But what does yoga mean there? Yoga means something closer to the way we're using it. It means it's a powerful means for controlling something. But he, as a king, as a Raja, he does not care whether someone writing a Hatha Yoga text or, whatever, he doesn't care if Krishnamacharya thinks that it's yoga or not. It doesn't matter to him because he's a king, he's a sovereign. He could care less what this guy thinks, right? So because, that's how he is in the world. He's at the top of the apex. And so, that question is for us very, very interesting. If you take the idea that yoga, as Sunila says, the means of controlling something powerful, then these other questions of whether this or that is yoga has to be answered differently. It may not be Hatha yoga, but it's clearly powerful, right? What the Raja is teaching is powerful. And people have gone on using that power, whether they call it yoga or not.
So in the case of Aundh, for the Raja, the Surya Namaskar, you asked him, like, is this religion or politics? He would reject the premise, the very premise of the question, right? He would say the Surya Namaskar is both. It is about the control of my body and therefore the control of my being in the exercise of my political liberation. And it was something that he understood for himself, that his practice of Surya Namaskar was essential for his existence as a sovereign. But it was also something that he felt like in the democratic future that he was envisioning was essential for everyone. It was essential for everyone in a democracy to be able to harness themselves in the exercise of their democratic existence.
Yeah. I suppose in that case, it's very libertarian, really. It's like, well, this works for me, in terms of making me a better person, and practically speaking, I know he had a religious bent as well, but then to then propagate it to his subjects, it's essentially his subjects, really, for social harmony. But it wasn't in that case a means of control of the subjects, quite, was it? It was to suggest that they would then self-control. And
yeah, absolutely. And we've learned a lot from Joe Alter's work on Gandhi and the Raja of Aundh, and his interest in Aundh is really via Gandhi, and Gandhi had a role to play in commenting on and providing suggestions for the Aundh's political constitution that was enacted in the late 1930s. It became actually one of the first instances, the first that we've found, of a democratic constitution. The Raja gives up the keys to his kingdom to his people, so that envisioning of a democratic future, he actually actualizes in the context of this tiny princely state of Aundh, made up of just 70 or so villages. And it's interesting that you use that word libertarian. It's interesting to think about it that way. I mean, what we've suggested, and it's not so explicitly stated in the book, but maybe is a part of future work that we hope to do, which is that yoga expresses this alternative genealogy or understanding of the word and the concept of sovereignty. That sovereignty isn't something that comes from the outside in, but actually emanates from the inside out. So the sovereignty of the people of Aundh starts in the first instance from each individual's self-control, and the exercise of that self-control producing a context of sovereignty, even in the overarching, ambit of the British Empire.
Yeah, I want to add to that something that it goes back to a point you made about being yoga making you a better person. We actually argue that is a kind of a moral judgment that we don't think is inherent in the core concept of yoga, but gets applied in any particular context. So what yoga does, we think, is it makes you a more powerful person. And Sinister Yogis is a great book for that or if you've read Roots of Yoga that Jim Mellison and Mark Singleton have put together, a lot of what yoga will give you is just power over other people. It'll give you force. It'll give you power. It'll give you energy. What you do with it, whether it makes you good or bad, is a different question. So Sunila pointing out that in Hatha Pradipika or Amrita Siddhi or Karanda Samhita, these texts that are staple Hatha Yoga texts, when they talk about a well-governed land, when they talk about a certain good spot for you to build your hut, and the yogis all have huts, to build your hut and your garden and your wall and all those things. That's actually a moral. There's the application of power to a moral world, but it is not inherent in the term itself.
I think it kind of supposes it, though, that you have to have people getting on with each other in order to do anything else. Otherwise, you've just got constant warfare.
Yeah. So that's kind of what we mean, is that there's a presupposition of the best way to carry out yoga. But we know of all the yogis who go to the terrible lands, the wild countries, totally unruly, for whom that asocial world is actually better for them. And of course, we have all the yogis who use their powers to control others and so on. So we kind of resist the idea that yoga inherently makes anyone better or worse. It just makes them more powerful. Then the question is, what do you do with that power? So Patanjali's yama, niyama, these kinds of things, I think you would naturally apply to anything powerful, right? You invent a powerful thing like a gun. You have to come up with laws because it's a powerful thing. What is the good way to use it? What's the bad way to use it? That's kind of how we see yoga, is a powerful thing.
I mean, just to jump in, I think, our insistence that for us, at least, yoga doesn't imply any particular moral order is also a way of making sense of why it is that the term and the ideas inherent in it become so attractive to authoritarian figures. So someone like Julius Evola, who's published a book with the same title as ours, The Yoga of Power.
But he did it first.
He did it first in the early 20th century, but also various figures in the National Socialists in Germany and other parts of Europe who really saw yoga as this very fascinating set of strategies and ideas around control. Because as you said, you can't have stability unless you have social harmony. You can have stability with an excessively repressive or authoritarian context as well. You'll have resistance to it, but similarly, any moment of social harmony can also erupt in disharmony at any moment, right? So it's a recognition that yoga has this kind of flexible, capacious sense that it can be appealing and can be deployed in lots of different political contexts
or moral ones. Yeah.
Do you just want to, before we move on from this subject, do you want to speak a little bit about the Raj again, the Raja of Aundh, and his project with it? Because people were really interested in that aspect of your book.
Bhavan Rao Srinivas Rao Pant Pratinidhi, and after we say it the first time, we just refer to him as the Raja, precisely because, as you said at the beginning, it's a very long name, and who wants to deal with that every time?
Yeah, his son was a little bit easier.
That research was super interesting for us, and of course, we arrived at that because of the work of Joe Alter, but also Goldberg and Mark Singleton and many others who've written about the Raja of Aundh. A lot of the debate about the Raja of Aundh was really focused on that question of whether the Surya Namaskar is properly understood as yoga or not. And it seemed to us like the debate had landed on the side of saying, no, it was a set of techniques, but it wasn't yoga. And one of the reasons that we suggest for that is that a lot of the work relied on the English texts, the 10-point way of health, as well as the English versions of the Surya Namaskar, in which the Raja of Aundh seems to be quite careful in not describing the Surya Namaskar as yoga. But all over his Marathi and other materials, which we
I think that was taken out by the publisher when it came to the UK, Louise Newton, wasn't it?
Yes, Louise Morgan.
She took it out. Yeah,
Morgan,
she changed it. Yeah.
Yeah, and but in his Marathi materials, it's very clear that he understands this as yoga. So part of what we were trying to do in that chapter is understand why it is that the English versions don't have that in it, and it's clear from his Marathi world that it is yoga. So that's part of what our interest was. The other part of it was just realizing that his fascination with Surya Namaskar was actually just one piece of a much larger set of unfolding experiments and revolutions and reform that he undertook in his tiny little state. I mean, it became this really remarkable place of art and literature and industry and political reform. So it was the site of the first democratic constitution. It was a place, despite its very small size, that seeded, what would become very large industrial enterprises in independent India. The Kirloskar brothers is probably the most famous, but there were a few others. It was also a place where you had, a commitment to universal primary education. So education was free for everyone. And the Surya Namaskar was the centerpiece of this education. All the school kids of Aundh had to do Surya Namaskar. So we were interested in understanding what role the Surya Namaskar had within this larger ambit of unfolding experiments in politics in Aundh.
And I think that the film represents this to some degree because he made this film in India. He made this for distribution throughout India because he had these emissaries. He essentially had a PR program around the Surya Namaskar. So he would send them all over and have them teach it. And he made that film, and he would bring copies of that film to Europe when he toured Europe, and leave copies, as he did in the British Film Archive, which is the copy that we found digitized and put online. But he would take film of modern agrarian technology, and he would take that film back to Aundh. So to go to Sunila's point, he was bringing Surya Namaskar over, but he was taking technology back. And we think you can't see those as disconnected. This is a project of empowerment, right? In which the Surya Namaskar is central because we understand, kind of going back to a mandala theory, that he saw himself at the center of a political system. And remember who his neighbors are. So Aundh is this it's like someone knocked a puzzle over, and there are puzzle pieces all over the ground. It's not a continuous place. It's surrounded by the British Empire. The British Empire is they surveilled all of the princely states with the effort to recover those lands.
It also became a place that various revolutionaries, anti-imperial revolutionaries, kind of sought refuge and hid out in some of Aundh's villages.
So imagine this man who is a king, but he's also surrounded by whatever the British crown is, right? It's what does he call it? What does he call it? The supreme power. There's some word he uses for it. That's the technical word that the semi-autonomous states, princely states, used for the British Empire because they weren't part of it, but they were subject to it, right? So this guy is coming with this film to the heart of empire. Right? He's coming to London with this film. How can one not see that as political? Right? From our point of view, we just can't see it any other way. Or even if he didn't intend it, and we know he did, how could anyone else not read it that way? So it's an extension of the same politics that would mean he would bring the video or the film of agricultural innovation back to Aundh, right? It's the same flow. It's not a different flow. It's just a different part of it. So it's a different part of that sovereignty that Sunila is talking about. How are you sovereign when you're surrounded by the enemy? And how do you form sovereignty? Which is one of the reasons why we talk about yoga in the context of other nationalists, the subject of chapter 3. Because we think that this idea resonated with a colonized people making an effort towards nationalism. It also did not resonate with people who felt they had already been colonized by centuries of caste patriarchy. So that's why we talk about Ambedkar and his rejection of some of these ideas. So there are no ways in which we can see yoga circulating here that is not political. But what it means is very different in each context. And it takes a lot of, effort to figure out what that is in each context.
Yeah, I would have liked to have seen you write a chapter on the Maharaja of Mysore and how he used yoga in a political context with Krishnamacharya, exactly that vein, really. Krishnamacharya was employed to teach young boys to give basically yoga demonstrations, right? For, in the context of proving a strong young Indian nation capable of sovereignty. Maybe.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we don't look at Mysore is we don't read. Kannada is not a language that we read or do research in. Also, it's been, so many scholars have looked at the context of Mysore and of Krishnamacharya and his huge influence in codifying psychophysical yoga practices and the kind of various streams of lineage of yoga practice lineage that emerged from his yoga atelier. So we were able to rely on all of that scholarship without feeling the need to focus ourselves there. I just wanted to bring up one last thing about the film, which is that we kept reading references to this film in the administrative reports of Aundh, that the Raja screened the film here and here, etc. We saw references to when it was first made, and we were really struggling to find any extant copies of the film in India. There is a chance that some of his family, who we interviewed and met, have a copy, but we're not sure the state of it, and it's not been digitized. And the film archives of India, which are located in Pune, also don't have. There's no copy there. So we kind of wrote to the British Film Institute on a lark, kind of like maybe there's some chance that they have a copy of the film. And our first response was that they don't. And the reason for that is that they had this film since the 1930s, when we believe that Raja must have left it there on a visit to London. But it wasn't indexed. It wasn't. So they had the film, but no one knew what it was, and no one had screened it. So it was very lucky. It was very fortuitous for us that we were able to connect with an archivist at the institute who was able to track this down, and then we had some funds from our University of Washington here to digitize it.
Yeah, I think I'll add to this that we, in addition to her saying this is Krishnamacharya's history that's kind of the epicenter of people talking about what modern yoga is, how yoga enters into the modern world. But as we were reading from the point of view of Maharashtra, Marathi, and the Raja, we were surprised by this narrative. Because long before, what leads the Raja of Mysore to bring Krishnamacharya to teach is already the world that is being created by figures like the Raja of Aundh. He's already creating this world. So we felt that the reason that Raja of Aundh existed as a kind of footnote to Krishnamacharya was because Krishnamacharya had the capacity, as you said earlier, he had the capacity to determine the terms of discourse around this concept of yoga, right? So he had the power to determine that his form of yoga would be connected to Hatha yoga, that would have this long ancient genealogy, and that would be this kind of transcendent philosophical thing. The Raja of Aundh had a very different approach, right? He's like, look, this is what my family did. It makes you healthy. He had this emphasis on gender, right? We talk about this. He had this, which is why 10-Point Way to Health is published essentially, which is very different.
And why his wife and his daughters and the schoolgirls of Aundh also feature very prominently in the film.
So we were surprised by this. How has this guy gotten erased? And when we went into the literature to say, well, how has this happened? We kind of see that the argument is it's not considered yoga, or it's not considered asana yoga, because even though he uses all these terms, asana, etc.
In the Marathi text.
He uses it. There's really two reasons. One is that the Raja never creates. There's no genealogy that follows the Raja after that, right? He's not trying to create any kind. He's not sending out. Now we're going to start the Raja of Yoga. The Raja of Yoga's brand of yoga. Nothing like that ever happens. Aundh yoga. None of that ever happens.
Perhaps he's a mystery is Krishnamacharya, really. When Krishnamacharya comes to the Mysore Palace, there are already Surya Namaskar classes going on, right? So
next
he finds
door,
yes. And then they seem to stop, and they seem to stop when he comes in, right? So we might suggest, if one was being, slightly thoughtful, that the Maharaj is quite an architect in kind of segueing Krishnamacharya and his yoga to the Surya Namaskar practice, because obviously Surya Namaskar is a perfect vehicle for modernity, right? Which is characterized by dynamism and motion, which is very much in line with the Raja of Aundh and his vision for
That's a good point.
taking a modern nation into something with a dynamic practice, rather than a static practice, which suggests determinism and fatalism and all the things that perhaps India recognized that it shouldn't have been, in terms of fighting against the British and not just letting them, somewhat letting them in. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Bhagavad Gita in that context and the freedom fighters? Because that was a really interesting chapter. I think your final chapter, the way that, obviously Gandhi has used ahimsa in the Bhagavad Gita, but you show that there's other people that have used the Bhagavad Gita in a very different context. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say one last thing about your question about Mysore, which is that what was interesting to us, we didn't focus intensively on Mysore, but what was interesting to us is that all of these things are happening in the context of princely states. So there was even in the amidst the surveillance that they were all undoubtedly under, there was also still the capacity, greater perhaps capacity to have these kinds of practices and lines of inquiry that were unfolding in both Mysore and in Aundh.
And then, maybe that's a good segue into the yoga and the use of it in the Bhagavad Gita, because obviously it was kind of disguised, right? Yoga was used as a kind of disguise for quite serious activism by the likes of Aurobindo and such.
Yeah, I mean, I would even argue that when they describe themselves as yogis, which many of them do, we focus in our book on 5 figures during the national period: Gandhi, Tilak, Aurobindo, Lajpat Rai, and Ambedkar. And in the case of the first 4 of them, they understood. We think that when they thought of themselves as yogis, they did understand the term to have a political valence. They weren't actually trying to disguise it. It's just that our perspective now has shorn yoga of its political qualities. And so when we look back on their texts and they describe themselves as being karma yogis, as being yogis, people have a tendency to think, oh, well, that's a reference to their religious or theological perspective. But actually for us, when we see those writers refer to themselves as yogis, we understand that to be a part of how they understood themselves politically.
Yeah, and if you look at modern yoga, it's all about the Yoga Sutras, isn't it? And the use of ahimsa. But obviously, you turn the Bhagavad Gita, which is much less used, and it's ahimsa is rather more active, right? I mean, Krishna is advising Arjuna to go out in the war and kill people and do it well.
Yeah, I think that this relates to one of the uses of the term yoga that we trace that also informs why the Raja did not use the word yoga in English. Because the context in which he's using the word is also the context in which the word yoga is appearing as a term of revolutionary resistance, right? And we name all the people that kind of use it. And we also talk about court cases where the British are trying, would-be assassins, attempted assassinations. And they're saying, you have yoga pamphlets, you refer to doing yoga as essentially carrying out bombing and activities like this. But they describe it as a perversion of the word, right? So it's interesting to see that in those court documents, the perspective that the British have is if you use yoga for violent resistance, it's not yoga, real yoga. Real yoga is this docile, pacifist philosophy, right? Which is an extraordinary kind of language power moment when they're clearly aware it's not true, but they want to institute the idea that it's true so that yoga can exist in this peaceful religion, non-political way. While clearly all the people using these terms, and even Ambedkar, who challenges these others who are using this term, they all see it as deeply about politics, action, and control. So that's an interesting problem that we think if you only look at the Gita, you don't get that larger context for how the word yoga was circulating, not only as something that the sinister yogis did, but the active, political, violent resistors did.
Tilak is interesting for us. He's one of the first to sort of take up the Gita and translate it and offer it as a as a tool for his political aims. And what he suggests in other writings, so in the Gita Rahasya, but also other things that he wrote, he suggests that like maybe you have the luxury, if you live in a well-governed land in a time of stability and peace, maybe you have the luxury of enacting your yoga via sort of contemplation and meditation. But if you live in a time of injustice and of social disharmony and of political chaos, you don't have that luxury. To be a yogi means to act in the world to create the conditions that you want to see. So he sort of he has this temporal distinction. Yeah. What it means to do yoga and to be a yogi depends on the context in which you live. And you know, if you're in a time of stability, fine, find your cave and meditate, or build your hut and contemplate. But if you live in a time of injustice and disharmony, which he perceived the British Empire to be, then it is incumbent on you to act in this world to change it. And that's one of the ways that we think these three spheres of yoga clearly intersect, even in the minds of figures like Tilak and Gandhi.
And I'd add to that with both Gandhi and with Aurobindo, you have these moments early in their careers when they're political activists where they encounter Hatha Yoga. And they're like, oh, that doesn't fit. That's like, you can't do that and do politics, right? So Gandhi has these moments where he's like, yeah, Hatha Yoga can be good for this or for that. But really, my yoga is spinning yarn, right? He says, that's my yoga. What does he mean by that? It's a political act resisting the British international economy around textiles. So he's doing something really powerful when he says that. Or Aurobindo in 1908 meets this yoga teacher who teaches him some breathing techniques. And Aurobindo's like, no, I got to get out in the world and disrupt and like fight the British. I don't have time for this. And of course, after Aurobindo is, hounded by the British for sedition, for something he writes in Karma Yogan, when he renounces the political world, he embraces this whole world of integral yoga. He creates this yoga, which is the yoga now of, not the political action he had earlier espoused. So there really does seem to be some set of conflicts, right, between a certain kind of yoga I don't relate it to a hatha kind of practice versus yoga as a political practice. And so that makes me reflect on when in these hatha texts, a yogi is supposed to live in a well-governed land. It's almost like, because if you don't, you can't do that yoga. Then the yoga you have to do is this other one where you resist the government, where you change the political conditions, and then you can go back to doing the other one. But you're not going to have a stable hut or a wall or a garden, all the things the yogi needs, if you don't have this other formation. But that too is yoga. They're connected. That's kind of one of the kind of big arguments we try to make in the book.
They're both doing yoga. It's just the context in which you're doing it is different, right? The context compels the yoga.
In the end, I think Aurobindo having a lot of time on his hands in prison, right? What's he going to do? He had to do something.
So many of them really start to think about these things and write these things while in prison. Because they were all accused of sedition.
That's also interesting. The only kind of way that we see the Gita is almost through that. I'm going to go back to it again. That lens of Gandhi, where it's just about ahimsa, right? We don't see the other face of it. Where these days, when we don't get told the other face of it, that this more kind of, let's say, for want of a better word, dynamic use of yoga in terms of, it's going back to the start, I suppose. Right? Why don't we allow this narrative into the more popular sphere where we can use yoga in a more kind of dynamic way? Or maybe we do. I
even think for Gandhi, like he really fundamentally rejected the idea that his form of yoga, satyagraha, ahimsa, these things were
karma yoga
that were passive. He understood this is why he insists on this term satyagraha, right? It's a grasping, a gripping, a firmness that is required of you, and it's anything but passive or quiescent. It's even Gandhi, the one who most clearly eschews the literal meaning of yoga as war. Even he understands that it is not the absence of action. It's just a different kind of action. We make another set of arguments about how Gandhi what Gandhi was doing through his yogic self-mastery and control was actually harnessing the potential for violence, right? So his fasts were a way of harnessing the potential for violence. I mean,
interesting.
It's not. It's
not.
It's not wrong. Yeah.
No, but the point is that Gandhi had his finger on a trigger.
Yeah.
Right. So when we think of ahimsa, nonviolence, what we think of is his method of in-person political resistance. Right. You allow yourself to be harmed by the aggressor state, because that puts you in a morally superior position. But what's often not talked about, though many other scholars have talked about this is not unique to us, other scholars have talked about this. As Sunila says, he harnesses violence. So that's what a fast is. When Gandhi is fasting, he is putting his death in the hands of the person who is so-called forcing him to fast. And in some cases, this may be the British, but in other cases, these are his own shoulder-to-shoulder fellow Indians who also want independence but don't agree with his route. With them too, he says, I'll fast unto death if you don't do what I think is right. Gandhi's death is not the risk. It's what happens after Gandhi's death that is the risk. The violence that Gandhi knew would explode, which did indeed happen after his death. That his death was not at the hands of a British person, however.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to a wider political context, isn't it? Of Gandhi's symbolic situation. Essentially, I still feel he was kind of pushing against an open door, and how Gandhi ends up being the symbol of the modern kind of Indian nation, really, right? So I suppose to wrap it up, maybe let's take it to the modern context and like the use of yoga by Modi and his Yoga Day, and maybe you could say a few words on more recent ideas, just to conclude our chat today.
Yeah. So one of the things we take up the modern period, the post-independence period, in the conclusion of the book, and one of the goals that we set ourselves in that conclusion is to try to understand the existence of yoga in this long period of time that really hasn't been addressed very fulsomely in the scholarship already. So that is the period from independence, 1947, until about the time that Modi ascends in 2014 in India. So a lot of the scholarship in that time period is looking at yoga's travels outside of India, how yoga emerges in Europe and the US, etc. But there's been very little trying to understand that time period in India. And one of the things that we point out is that Modi is building on things that have already been underway and in place for many decades. So that right from independence onwards, in fact, even before independence, you have the first debates about whether psychophysical yoga instruction should be a part of Indian education curriculum. And after independence, you have a kind of very clear embrace of yoga for both public health purposes and curricular education purposes by various governments. From the discussions begin in the 50s, but you have it really sort of institutionalized from the 70s onwards. And that precedes Modi by many decades.
No, so that missing history we think is necessary because Modi does very significant things. He raises a department of health to the level of a ministry. So that's a big deal that he does in terms of power and visibility. And he creates International Yoga Day. These are two important things he does. And by important, I mean significant. Like it clearly has an impact, right? But that is possible because of that other history that Sunila points out that we're trying to trace. If you don't know that history is in place, you don't know that prime ministers on the other side of this political spectrum were also supporting yoga, then you don't know what the unique brand of that association relies on when Modi takes over. And that is because Modi's politics is of a particular kind that becomes laid over his emphasis on yoga, right? So that is that connection that many scholars have made. We want to provide that longer genealogy that gives him the power to do that when his party is elected in 2014.
Yeah. So Christian's point is that a lot of people say, well, Modi established the Ministry of Yoga, and that's true. But what he did was not actually establish it from scratch. He elevated something that already existed as a department, right? At one tier of government, of bureaucratic existence, to a higher tier. So he doesn't create it. He elevates something that already existed.
Yeah.
So that is a good sort of encapsulation of one of what we're trying, one of our aims in this concluding chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of antecedents. I mean, really, Shivaji and Ramdas and Modi and Ramdev, right? Like the Surya Namaskar and all of that. I mean, there's definitely a lot that's been before. I mean, I suppose, is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude? I mean, obviously, I've got just to say that I love the book. I mean, it's it's not the easiest read. I mean, it takes somewhat perseverance. I mean, it's complicated as our conversation has explained today. But I really encourage everyone to get it, because it really does just flesh out so much more context in the whole yoga debate, which is really exciting actually, and really new. So thanks for all your work. I mean, it's just great to read. Thank you. I mean, you've spoken so much and so well. Can you leave us with any final words? Well, I've just reached the edge of my capacity for hung on for dear life, and my pseudo academic guys. So thank you for helping me out here.
Well, I'll just say something that we actually say at the very end of the book, which is that there are ways, we think there are clear ways in which these three spheres of yoga, as we call them, are related. And so even if you understand yourself to really be interested in yoga philosophy, we think that you'll find the arguments that we make about yoga as a set of ideas related to power and politics relevant, because those things are related. Similarly, if you're interested in yoga, mind-body practice, the arguments that we make about yoga as power are relevant still to you, because these ideas of yoga that interbraid and intertwine over the long millennia in which the term exists are all related terms. They're all related understandings.
I think, as Skunk Anansi said, everything is political, I mean, yoga doesn't unfortunately escape their context, and whatever context we understand yoga, it's always with an underpinning of politics to understand it better.
Maybe it's not unfortunate, but it's fortunate.
And maybe that's not a bad thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Maybe that's not a bad thing after all. Well, it is the way it is. So, we're going to make what we do of it. Thanks, guys, for coming on. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll put links below to the book. You can purchase the book. It's a super good book. So go buy it, guys. Thanks again, Christian and Sunila. Thank you for coming on. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you.
Cheers.